I see a little red button on my screen. Georgina, do you see anything on your screen that signifies?
There is a record button, but I don't see any indication that we're recording.
Okay, so I see one that says it is recording, so I am hoping this works. Oh, thank you, Marcy.
In the upper left-hand corner, there's a red light that says recording.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, then let's get started. So we have this Inclusive Pedagogy Workshop. Welcome, welcome. We are the facilitators today. My name is Amanda. I am one of the librarians at Green River, and I have Georgina here with me today. She is an adjunct German instructor. And we are doing our workshop today on accessibility, equity, and meeting students at their information needs. Before we begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about the recording itself. So we have set up the presentation with live captions, just to show that this is a cool thing that you can do. So this is through Google Slides, and you can set up, some people have told me that they can see the menu when I hover over the screen. And if you select captions, that it will actually generate automatic captions as you are talking. The limitation is that it only does this for the person who is presenting these slides. So while my words will get captioned here, Georgina's will not. But at the very end, when we are going to take this recording to Kim, and she will formally caption this, and we will share that recording to everyone. That is the plan. With that said, let's get started. So before we begin, we really want to acknowledge the land that we are all coming from into this virtual space. And we want to acknowledge that we are living and working on lands that have been cared for and stolen from the Coast Salish peoples, which includes the tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So I know I've had conversations with Leander, our Native American student advisor, and he has spoken of land acknowledgements having power to show continued existence and resilience of Native American and other indigenous peoples today. So with that, Georgina and I kind of took that to heart, and we did some investigating, and what we did was we found NASO's Instagram profile. So that's our Native American student organization. We did some learning into their activities, and I reached out to Tea, the Native American peer navigator and NASO student leader. And she has offered this video created by NASO students to show us and wrote a message for us to hear. So that is for our land acknowledgement, something that I would like to share with us today. Sorry. I think I shared computer audio, so let's try it.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the introductory video on NASO. We're going to be talking about a few things. What does NASO stand for? What is NASO's mission? And who can join? Let's get started. NASO stands for the Native American Student Organization. Native Americans are the indigenous people of the land. We are the people who inhabited this land before the settlers came. What is our mission? NASO aims to create a safe community for both natives and their allies to gather. We want to be able to share and learn new things about indigenous cultures and how that may relate to other cultures. We also want to provide a creative space where indigenous voices can be heard. Because our population is so small, it may be difficult for our voices to be recognized. So who can join? Everyone is welcome at NASO. You do not have to be Native American, and you don't even have to be a student at Green River. Our student leader is Tea. Z is the peer navigator at ODEI. Our faculty member is Leander. He is the Native American student advisor. For any further questions, you can go to our Instagram at grcnaso or email us. We hope to see you.
Yay. I've seen that video so many times. It's really awesome. They created
Hello,
that
everyone,
in
and welcome
2020 quarter to welcome these students. And Tea also had some words to share with us today. She says to, or Zay, Zem, Zer, I think I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So actually that is my part. I should have checked that pronunciation. But Taya says, thank you to the tribes who inhabit these lands presently and previously. Thank you to the land, the plants, and the animals for raising us and supporting us where we stand today. It is our relationships with one another that builds the base for community. Your sacrifices and kindness will not be taken for granted. We deeply appreciate your cooperation. So when I asked her what Taya would like to share with everyone, with faculty here, those are the words that they wrote. So thank you for that. With that said, let's start.
Well, I just wanted to go over today's plan for our workshop. So first, Amanda and I will share some details about our own backgrounds and identities. Next, we're going to discuss the intersectional relationship of accessibility, equity, and student identities before addressing how this interplay impacts learning. We will then shift the conversation to how our choices as designers have the potential to promote equity. Following that, we will spend some time in small groups going over examples provided by fellow Green River College faculty who are actively incorporating principles of equity and accessibility when selecting and creating course materials. Finally, we will round out the session with some time for Q&A.
Okay, so a little bit about us. Just because identity is so important for this session. Hello, my name is Amanda. I have met quite a few of you, but for those of you who I've not met, I am a librarian at Green River College. I am on the tenure track. So this is my second year at Green River. It's also my second year in the Washington CTC system as a whole. So this is the first experience for me. I received my Master's of Library and Information Science at the UW. I also have a master's in second language studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So those two experiences have really shaped the way I think about pedagogy. I have lived in 7 different states and 2 different countries. Before I became a librarian, I spent about 7 or 8 years teaching English language and literature in a lot of different contexts. I am Chinese American. I am firstborn with all the complexities that come with being a firstborn child in a Chinese family. I am cis female. I am able-bodied. I do live with a couple of invisible disabilities though.
Hi, my name is Georgina Garretson. I'm a German teacher at Green River. I've been here since spring of 2019. I am an adjunct and am currently serving as a faculty in residence on accessibility. I have a master's in teaching foreign language with an emphasis in German from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, or I should say, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. It's changed names since I went there. I've lived in 4 states as a military brat and 4 different countries. I'm Caucasian, dual citizen, cis female, able-bodied. I am a dyslexic, that is the daughter of a dyslexic and the mother of a dyslexic.
Mm-hmm. That's super important. Thanks for sharing that. Well, okay, so let's get started. So this is our second full quarter into remote learning, perhaps even your third quarter if you were teaching over the summer. And we are all still on the struggle bus. At least I know I am, and I have heard anecdotally from others as well. Teaching remotely is a bit different from online teaching, right? We were all kind of thrown into this situation without much preparation. And with many of our students, teachers, and student support offices who did not choose to be in an online learning environment willingly. So even for those of us who have been teaching online before, the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism have impacted us all, leaving us isolated when we really just need community. So I'm hoping part of today is a space where we can be in community and struggle together. We are all here because we want to be in conversation about education and instruction, and we want to build spaces for our students that embrace them and allow them to succeed. And last spring when I facilitated, I'm not sure how many people were able to come, but last spring in the part 1 session for this Inclusive Pedagogy Workshop, we were all kind of at a loss in how to do this remote learning environment thing. But you know, silver lining that this being our second or third quarter of this situation is we actually have now tried some things, and we do have some evidence from students that helps us figure out where to focus our pedagogical practice on and what to really think about as we continue into winter and spring. So what I have on the slide here, Student Affairs has sent out a survey to all students at the end of summer to see how they were experiencing their spring and summer quarters online during a pandemic. I'm putting this link to the survey responses in these slides, and I will share the slides with everyone at the end of the session, so you will have that to explore. And I really highly encourage you to read through the short responses. There were like hundreds of them, and I spent a couple of hours reading each one. I noticed a ton of common themes, and those have really shaped a lot of today's workshop. So here's one example comment that I felt really captures a lot of what students were saying. Because when asked about how their spring quarter was going, the student said it was like super frustrating. They felt like they had a lot of unanswered questions. They felt like the work that was being given to them was really rushed. They felt like they didn't have a chance to really check in to see how they were doing, how other students were doing, to see if they were doing assignments right. They were really struggling with time management, and they didn't feel like they could reach out to anyone because they felt like they were just going to get a, well, we're all kind of struggling here, so kind of deal with it attitude. They said that directions were not always clear on Canvas and that they wished professors were a bit more understanding. So just this one comment alone really encapsulates a lot of what our students are saying to us. We know that students in this remote learning, they're finding this environment really challenging, right? There's feelings of isolation, there's anxiety, uncertainty of what's coming up next, how to do something in a class, and frustration when students are trying to work through class content without that in-person community of their teacher and their classmates to help support that learning. So when we all moved online, the landscape of our interactions with each other changed drastically, and the complexities of both the faculty and student identities kind of became really flattened behind the screen. And that's one thing that we want to think about. But you know, I think by now many of us have varying degrees of success through trial and error and lots of training with e-learning, right, in designing our online learning spaces to try to be just as engaging and affirming of a community as our in-person learning spaces are. So what Georgina and I are hoping to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about intersexual learner identities, particularly as they're impacted by issues of accessibility and equity. Then review some of the content and really think about that from the last Inclusive Pedagogy Workshop with some new content. And then hopefully spend a really good chunk of time in conversation with each other to share some of our experiences and what we've learned so far. I've mentioned this before, that Georgina and I, neither of us are experts on this topic. We really enjoy reading these topics a lot and talking about these topics with others. So we hope that this first part of the session has some interesting information for you all. And we hope that the second part of the session is a great space for us to kind of share our expertise with each other. So that's kind of what today is shaping out to be.
And so as Amanda said, this virtual format is relatively new for the majority of us. And it's one that has exacerbated a lot of pre-existing barriers to equity and accessibility. The digital divide has been particularly stark for minoritized students and non-traditional students. This is not just an issue of access to equipment and Wi-Fi, but also of familiarity with computers and the internet in general. We're seeing also situations with students facing language barriers that are proving more challenging since nonverbal cues are more difficult to pick up on in virtual formats. This particularly affects our international students, our recent immigrants, our refugees, students, and students with learning disabilities such as audio processing disorder. Virtual interactions have also led to an uptick in microaggressions towards BIPOC students and members of the LGBTQ+ community. Asian Americans and international students from Asian countries have also reported being blamed by fellow students for COVID in these new digital formats. So now we're going to revisit this slide that we have looked at in previous inclusive pedagogy workshops. So most of us are familiar with the ideas represented by these three images. All of them are addressing how to make education fair. So first, in our first picture, we have the equality approach where everyone gets the same thing. This is a very outdated model, and it effectively denies educational opportunities to large swaths of the student population. In the second picture, we have the accommodation model. Just so everyone is clear, an accommodation is a support provided by the institution to students who qualify. They are legally required by the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. Examples of accommodations include extended test time or being allowed to type in-class essays versus handwrite them. Those are two accommodations that my son has currently. Although this model enables more students to participate equitably at the post-secondary level, the onus is squarely on the students to disclose their disability. In the accessibility model, instead of providing common supports such as formatting with headers for screen readers or captioning videos on a case-by-case basis, they are incorporated by the institution and instructor from the onset. This approach takes the onus off of the student and puts it on the institution and the instructor. Special needs are present in every demographic, but academic accessibility doesn't exclusively benefit these students. Other students that benefit are ELL students, students balancing family care or working while enrolled, they also will benefit from these types of accessibility features like screen readers and captions. Accessibility really should be viewed as a vital component of equity and not a separate issue.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, totally. Like accessibility in instructional design, we really think about who our learners are, right? So we have this responsibility as educators. And similar to that, when we think about equity in education, that's the same thing, right? We're calling explicit attention to who our learners are and to respond to them as individuals and not as this one aggregate group with a single normal perspective. So while accessibility, often the research centers around learner identities with differing abilities, equity, on the other hand, centers on race, and both of these kind of go hand in hand. As Estella Ben-Simon from the Center for Urban Education at USC points out, it's, you know, when we think about equity, it's not the achievement gap that we should be really concerned about. It is the whiteness and the institutionalized racism that creates structures from which these barriers are born from. So we must recognize, for example, how higher education is rooted in anti-Blackness and how this impacts our Black and Brown students who come to this learning space with both the barriers that they faced behind them in the K through 12 system and the barriers that they are faced with going forward. And what we want to do in the first part today is to name these identities and these barriers, particularly the ones that impact learning and community due to the overlapping issues of accessibility and equity. But to be clear though, these barriers are not due to a deficit on learners' part. So that's something I want to make clear. These barriers are constructions that we have built up in our colleges and individual classrooms through practices that are deeply rooted in a white, cis male, and able-bodied perspective. So when we do not explicitly see learner identity, we typically see a white, cis male, and able-bodied student. And this is how we implicitly design our instruction. So we need to first look at some of the ways that we see identities at Green River. And here is the quick fact sheet from this past academic year, published by our Institutional Effectiveness Office. Here we do see some disaggregated data. We attempt to move away from assuming that all white male perspective by listing percentages of how many first generation students we have, how many students who report disabilities, how many students who report a race or gender, how many students report veteran status. We know these percentages, but how often do we further complexify this data? So for example, to what extent are we recognizing that these identities do overlap? So for example, we do have conversations about veterans and disability, but how about disability and race, right? So when we consider who is in our learning space, to what extent are we thinking how one's race, gender, or socioeconomic status is impacting their access to accommodations or their ability to engage in class without being seen as a behavioral problem? To what extent are these issues being exacerbated, but also made further invisible by the fact that we're all teaching and learning behind computer screens? So now Georgina is going to unpack some of these intersecting identities, after which I'll share some things to think about as we design instruction and learning spaces.
Okay, so there are many barriers related to race and gender and class that prevent or delay students from getting an official diagnosis, which is needed to qualify for accommodations. For example, minorities are diagnosed later in life and less often than their white peers. This can be due to lack of access to healthcare, but there are also underlying bias that impact their ability to get a diagnosis in the first place. Signs of learning disabilities are often labeled bad behavior by clinicians, families, and teachers in minority populations. And also less obvious disabilities tend to go undetected at higher rates in these groups than they do in white communities. For recent immigrants, they may not be provided experienced interpreters or screening materials for various disabilities that are produced in their language, which can hinder a diagnosis. For women and non-binary people, there's also issues relating to how research on different disabilities is conducted. For example, in autism, it's largely centered around cis males. And there is an unconscious bias among medical professionals, teachers, and society as a whole that considers autism a largely male phenomenon. Cis females are socialized in a way that teaches them to camouflage their traits, which further compounds the issue. They present signs of autism differently than males, leading to a backlog of adult women and non-binary people who have been left out of the picture entirely. And then once a diagnosis is given, interventions can also be unequal. So the cost of intervention, time off work for appointments, and transportation issues to treatment disproportionately affects BIPOC communities and those living in poverty. One study showed a disparity of $8,000 per client between clinics in a predominantly Black and Latinx community and a clinic in a predominantly white community. More disturbingly, BIPOC students are far more likely to receive special education services in classrooms segregated from their general education peers versus their white counterparts with the same diagnosis, which reinforces the school to prison pipeline. For non-traditional students, especially if there has been a lengthy gap between graduating high school and re-enrolling, locating documentation to qualify for accommodations can also be burdensome. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. This is the part that I find most important in understanding the need for accessibility. It's really important to note that at the K-12 level, special needs and accommodations are automatically disclosed to the instructor. However, at the post-secondary level, students are responsible for self-disclosure, and only a fraction of them choose to do so. For example, only 24% of students with specific learning disabilities like dyslexia or audio processing disorder choose to disclose their accommodation. Often stigma is at the root of this decision. Students, out of a sense of autonomy or need for autonomy, often, just like any student starting at a new college or university, want to make a fresh start, and often they believe that they have outgrown their disability and do not fully understand the importance of their accommodations and how that will impact their student success later. Often asking asking officially for accommodations is contrary to people's identity and sense of self. We see this very often with veteran students, 12 to 30% of which have non-apparent disabilities, such as PTSD or mild traumatic brain injury. Help seeking is viewed as at odds with military culture, and this is often termed the warrior ethos. Students cite fear of being pitied or viewed as tragic by their instructors and peers. According to Harris and Wood, Black males are similarly conditioned not to show vulnerabilities, which dissuade them from disclosing their accommodations. If we take the cultural perspective into account, that also can affect people's decisions to disclose their accommodations. For example, in traditional Asian families, disabilities may be viewed as strictly a family matter. And this view may go as far as to never have the individual diagnosed, or families may refuse services completely. There's also issues with disableism and ableism. If these practices are seen by students, that conveys the message that students with disabilities are not valued or do not exist. Next slide, please. So if we look at the long-term impacts on life goals and education that not disclosing accommodations will end up creating, the research shows that a large number of the students with disabilities are not disclosing their accommodations. And those that who do not disclose their accommodations during the first year of college are 3.5 times less likely to graduate. The earlier that they disclose, the better their GPA is. People with learning disabilities face higher levels of unemployment and underemployment than their non-learning disabled peers. So those who have learning disabilities are 46%, are employed at a 46% rate versus 71% of their non-disabled peers. They are also 2 times more likely to drop out of the workforce entirely. However, here's our silver lining. If they graduate college, their rate of employment is slightly higher than their non-learning disabled peers at 75%. And students with special needs report feelings of isolation and low self-esteem at higher rates than their peers. This quote by Rua M. Williams, a non-binary autistic blogger, speaks to this. Until we attend to the full diversity of autistic traits in confluence with gender, sexuality, culture, ethnicity, race, and class, we will continue to miss people and they will continue to feel lost. Next slide, please. So this quote from Sarah Manchanda, a disabled BIPOC graduate student working toward a PhD in special education at University of Florida, puts the problem in perspective. Legal accommodations do not directly translate into access. The lack of access to reasonable accommodations comes in many forms and is a consistent challenge. Peers, professors, and mentors who know about my disability-related challenges and associated legal accommodations care about my success. However, some have at times forgotten to provide these legal and necessary supports on a consistent basis. I have been asked while making a presentation in front of a large group to read text off of a slide verbatim, although my vision does not allow me to do so. I have sat in classes unprepared for discussion because I have not received the readings in an accessible format. Manchanda also reports pushback from professors and being shamed for using her accommodations to which she is legally entitled and her professors are legally required to provide. She goes on to say, Whether or not faculty and leaders in the field externally validate this belief, I belong here. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're seeing all this stigma that leads to these implicit and explicit barriers to success. So there's a lot of issues to unpack here, but what can we do as educators to proactively design our learning spaces to be more inclusive, keeping in mind our own biases that we may have already identified, but we must still challenge daily as we make decisions about our learning space and our students. And this goes back to the ideas for accessibility and equity, right? So what is our responsibility as educators and as designers? In these last few slides, what I really wanted to do was spark some pathways to instructional design through some critical questions. I'm using literature in these 3 areas that are on the slide, and I'm sharing the resources here for you all when we leave this session. For the first section for information behavior, I really appreciate information behavior research, 1, because I'm a librarian and information is my profession. But 2, because education involves the co-creation of knowledge, which is born from information and which is vital to understand because how my sense of an interaction with the world is different from someone else's. And for the second one, I turn to universal instructional design to really pick up some practical tips and the intentions behind these techniques in using things like headers in my document or breaking up my Canvas text in lists rather than large chunks of prose. These pedagogical practices really help me as a mostly able-bodied person to stay aware of how I design my materials so that all my students of varying abilities can access, make sense of, and process my content. And then finally, I often turn to these transformative pedagogies rooted in equity, culturally responsiveness, and cultural sustainability to remind myself and kind of refresh my why this is all really important to think about and why I must continually assess my worldview and challenge the internalized white supremacist thinking within me that has led me to see my learning space as one way when it is really actually many ways. There are many ways of knowing, thinking, and doing. And so I'm going to use this literature to give some examples to the questions I pose, but overall, I don't want to spend too much time presenting on this literature itself. Much of what I'm sharing and recommending here, I really can't do justice by dropping one quotation or 2. These are all pedagogical ideas that we need to sit with and reflect on because it is through that cycle of reflection and action that we obtain the praxis and pedagogy that Freire calls for in liberatory education. So after this, that's why I linked to many of these sources. Some of these are Green River specific and you can find them through Holman Library. Some of them are not, or through the faculty and staff portal. So I encourage everyone to take time with these resources after. What I will do instead is pose the questions that I often think of whenever I am designing materials or curriculum and give some breadcrumbs into what I think of when I get into the weeds of that question. And these questions are informed and guided by the resources that I share here. Then we'll use those questions and ideas when we workshop some instructional materials in our breakout rooms. And I'll share more detail in a bit, but in the breakout slides for today, I include these same questions and resources. So during the breakout time, groups will have a chance to explore these questions deeply, either with the knowledge they already have and can share with others, or through the resources on the slide. So there's lots of opportunity to just unpack a lot of stuff here. So I ask myself a lot of things when I think, when I design content. And I was trying to think about ways to kind of really frame it and package it today. I think asking someone to do that in 10 minutes is like a lot, right? So what I did was I tried to organize some questions I often think about in 2 categories. The first category is what I consider when I design material and content that I present to students. And the second category is the kind of co-creation aspect of education, where I consider the communication pathways and collaborations between teachers, students, support offices, and beyond. So when I think about materials and content presentation, here are 4 big questions I think of. For the first, how are students making sense of and accessing this information? So as we mentioned before, we all have different worldviews. This is seen with Dervin's sense-making theory. This is seen with Bell Hooks's cultural codes. This is seen with Freire when he's talking about critical dialogue. And we all know this. So how do we come into an instructional material with our different senses and our lived experiences that impact how we kind of interpret things like project instructions or something like that? And when we think about accessing, we're thinking about that in terms of processing content, so accessibility, but we're also thinking about it in terms of things like cost barriers to class materials. So how are students accessing the class if they're unable to pay for a textbook? So are we making choices such as using free or low cost materials or trying our best to make that happen? The second question is, how are students experienced in communicating and learning information? And this is all to do with things like how are we taught to process and pass on information by our communities? So Hammond talks a lot about like these deep cultures we have, such as oral. Are we raised in these kind of oral communities or more predominantly written communities? And those really impact the way we process and are used to processing information. Then also, how can we design materials and content through different modalities and methods that reach students across communication and learning preferences? For example, can we use things like a photo voice activity that is mentioned by Grier-Reed and Williams-Wengart to have students respond to content through photo and written reflection rather than having the written word only? So what are ways that we are interacting with content? The third question is, how are students processing audio, visual, and textual information? So this is a lot of to do with things like web practices. With a lot of the resources that e-learning share talks a lot about color contrasts and little tools that you have in PowerPoint or Microsoft Word that can help you check the accessibility and how other students will view the content. We also want to think about cognitive processing and the fact that on average, our brains can only actively process information for about 12 to 20 minutes, depending on age, before it shuts down automatically to cycle through and consolidate that information for about 10 minutes. So for about 10 minutes, that is what our brains are doing, and we are not taking in new information. So how does this impact how we structure our lectures, our videos, and our long pages of content? And then last, how are students engaging with, affirmed by, and co-creating the information? So in what ways are we viewing the teacher and student relationship in this learning space? Are we using the banking model that Freire warns us against, in which we kind of just fill up our students' brains and assume them to be empty containers? Or are we fostering this co-creation of knowledge that Hooks, Mata, Freire, and Peirce speak of? And in what ways can we kind of unpack and decolonize our curriculum so that our content, our activities, and our assessments are structured in ways that validate this cultural pluralism, right? So this idea from Peirce that our students are coming to us to this white and able-bodied academic culture with other cultural knowledges in their pockets, ranging from communities of race and ethnicity to cultures we might see in, for example, neurodivergent communities, and that those cultures are just as valid and should be sustained side by side with the class culture that we teach, not diminished or erased. So how can we structure our activities and assessments to do that? The second category has to do with designing learning communities and communication pathways. And this is a little bit, we talk about this a lot too, so I won't unpack too much research in here, but we want to talk about the communication pathways between the teacher and student, between the student and student, between student and support services, and then how this whole community comes together in this educational ecosystem. Right? So when we talk about student to teacher interaction, you know, in this online learning environment, we no longer have those 10 minutes before and after class to build our communities, to chat casually, to have that bit of personal interaction. So how can we build this type of interaction into our online learning spaces that are not just this transactional communication required to fill assignments? And in what ways can we use our knowledge of help-seeking barriers that Georgina kind of mentioned to help us build help-seeking routines with our students and foster the community that is vital for them to encourage help-seeking? For student-to-student communication, we know that we are the designers of this learning space. So how can we design intentional communication channels that foster collaborative and inclusive student-to-student interaction? So this is thinking of not just simply having a space and letting people go at it in a discussion, but challenging microaggressions and facilitating sometimes hard conversations. So what is our responsibility to design that in or to be maintaining those communication channels? For pathways between student and support services, we know that our student support offices are vital to the educational ecosystem, and they wrap around our individual class environments. So in what way are we collaborating with these services to co-create our learning spaces? And as a librarian who is both doing library workshops, but also who teaches the credit-bearing course, this is something that's personally very interesting to me, to think about what ways are we collaborating as a whole. And that kind of leads into the last question about community. So when we think about all previous 7 questions, how are we bringing this all together into a constellation map that guides our students through a learning space, pointing the way rather than forcing students to find their paths between the different stars on their own, right? That means more than intentional collaborations between classes, programs, and offices, but maybe even beyond into the communities outside of Green River. So how are we building this map to help students navigate that? That's a lot of questions. So take a second. We're going to, not a lot of answers, but I put a lot of things that I think about that help me make decisions regarding the questions. But that's kind of what we'll be discussing in our breakout groups today.